Hello, good afternoon. Many thanks for being here. I'm Rosalie Dobell. I'm the curator at the Institute of Contemporary Arts. And on behalf of all of us at the ICA, I'm really, really excited to welcome you to this important in-conversation with Chelsea Manning and James Bridle. We, as an organisation, are increasingly aware of the importance of free spaces for direct and unmediated discussion. And so we're really hugely thankful to Chelsea and James for travelling to join us here. To be present together in this room. And also significantly, we're really grateful to you, our members and audience, for joining us here to share this conversation. We hope you'll also join us this week, in the coming weeks, at our home on the Mall, to view our new exhibition, Version History, by artists, filmmakers and designers Meta Haven, which opens in the galleries tomorrow. And please also join us in our Theatre for Queen's Row, which is a newly commissioned play by playwright and director Richard Maxwell. We would encourage you to please check out our Red membership to skip some queues and for access for events all year round. So, to introduce today's guests, we have technologist Chelsea Manning, who's a vocal advocate for government transparency and LGBTQ+ rights. Chelsea is now traveling internationally, speaking and writing on the social, technological and economic ramifications of AI and on the practical applications of machine learning. Chelsea is joined by James Bridle, who is an artist and writer working across technologies and disciplines. His writing on literature, culture, and networks have appeared in numerous publications such as Wired, The Guardian, and The Observer. His new book, New Dark Age, about technology, knowledge, and the end of the future, has this year also been published by Verso. Both speakers share deep concern for our future, and particularly the difficulties we face as a society in trying to effect major change in an era when new technologies atomize our cultures and communities rather than draw them together. Some thanks for today's event go to Vivian Westwood and to Freeze for their support, and to Liz at Evil Twin Booking Agency for her coordination, to Jen Robinson and to Kingsley Napley, and to a major donor who wishes to remain anonymous. For those of you who are tweeting today, we're using the hashtag Chelsea Manning ICA. I know that all of us here share a very deep respect for Chelsea's astounding bravery and for James's important writing and artistic intervention. So I'd now please ask you to put your hands together and join me in a very warm and thankful welcome to Chelsea and James.
Thank you all very much for that warm welcome and for all for being here. Thanks to the ICA and the Royal Institution for having us here. I'm really excited about what we can talk about over the next hour. We're going to talk for a while and then there'll be a short Q&A at the end of the thing. But really we're here to talk to Chelsea and to hear a little bit, primarily about what she's up to now, with a little bit of background to that as well, which we're all fascinated in. So I would like to start really by asking you, it's been over a year now, and you came out of prison to a world that you described as being very different. What did you want to see in the world? What made you become active in the way that you have done in the last year?
Right. So when I first got out of prison, because, when you're in prison for a long time, which I was, and I had a 35-year sentence, and I had no idea, where in that range I would ever get out. It seems so far and it seems so distant, so you don't really have a plan or a vision of what that looks like. So I had 4 months to maybe grapple with this, but a lot of this time was spent thinking about retiring, heading home, a lot of this notion of settling down, riding off into the sunset. But the reality is that whenever I did get out, because I kind of had that idea in my head, many of the things that drove me into doing whether it's the leaks or any of the work that I've done in the last decade, prison advocacy or anything like that, it's been mostly driven by this idea that I see the world in this way because of what I've been able to experience, being both, being homeless, being in prison, being in the military, and that drove me, like having this value set about like what the world is, and like the sense of like the police state, the intelligence apparatus, and the military, and the rise of authoritarianism, like really drove me to do this. And it's really accelerated. It's like somebody like hit the gas pedal while I was away and just like really rammed it up, and it's inescapable. Like I'm constantly bombarded by reminders of how different and how drastically, different the world really is. And this whole notion of like, oh, well, you get out of prison and you're free now, turned out to be a bit of a, it turned out to be a bit of a downer in that sense, because what happened was we really built this large, big prison, which is the United States, in the meantime. It was already happening. It's just it really intensified. You think about the surveillance systems like cameras or the police presence. And you think about the fact we have like walls around our country now, and that's very much the same thing that's inside of a prison. And so I just see a lot of these I see a lot of like similarities between the world out here and the world that was in there.
Because you worked on systems that are related to that
Yes.
both prior to your military service and during your military service. What
Right.
were those systems that you were working on?
So I mostly worked with statistical analysis. So before I was in the military, I worked as an intern at a couple. I worked as an intern at a company, as a program at another company, and basically what I did was marketing and promotion, and I really developed these tools are developed in a marketing context to predict who's going to buy what when, and so you take all this data like locations and interests and mix it all together to try to build predictions or build a profile or a model. We were using the same thing in Iraq and Afghanistan. I can't really get into the specifics of it. Obviously, there's national security and all that stuff, but the general basis, the mathematical basis of these tools in being able to make predictions is largely the same. And so now the techniques they've changed obviously in the last 10 years. Beforehand, it was Bayesian statistics, which I won't get into that, but it was basically it was a very conventional approach, but now there's a neural network approach, which speeds up the learn, and it's more of a learning process than it was more like a predictive analysis, like statistical analysis process before that was learning, but now it's really starting to like the approach to artificial intelligence is much, much more rigid than it was now. But the intent of these systems, to predict, who might be a target for, for surveillance, or to be killed in a drone strike, or to have their credit application denied, or to be, a customer, or to have advertising. A lot of these intentions are the same. It's just that the systems are much bigger, the data sets are much larger, and frankly, it's a lot scarier in how accurate it is. I think I've seen as few as 5 data points be able to to predict exactly what kind of person you are based upon seemingly random data points, like a credit card purchases. There's an astounding amount of information that you can glean off of a person based upon their credit card purchases if you have a large enough database and you have these, and you're running these through machine learning algorithms.
And what we've seen, what you're describing, is the way in which those systems over the last decade or more have moved from being stuff happening perhaps in marketing companies, have been kind of beefed up by the military, and are now kind of returning back into the civilian zone.
Right, and it was actually it was concurrent development. So what was happening in social networks was happening in the Department of Defense simultaneously. At least that's what I saw. But the intent is very different. And also the social impact of social networks is much deeper. It's not as consequential in terms of surveillance or getting targeted for, police surveillance or warrants or anything like that. It's much more about the kinds of life consequences, like what kind of articles you get, what kind of information that you see, what kind of advertising data, what kind of advertising gets put into you or like shown to you, and so. Like the intent is very different, and the effects are very different, but the underlying tool is the same.
And do you think that's sort of widely understood? As someone who has a background kind of technically in this stuff and obviously has been involved in movements around it and talks to a lot of people who work on it, how well do you think people understand the technologies behind it and the social effects of them?
I mean, people in technology obviously really have a much more intuitive understanding of the connections because it's the same tools. But I think that the general population is learning. I think it's certainly not an awareness problem. I think that the general public I'm pretty confident to say that we're very aware of the kinds of issues that are brought up with AI and machine learning, and with the kinds of policies that come along with that, and the kinds of companies that take advantage of that. So I think it's not an awareness problem. I think it's a problem of what to do about it.
Certainly. So again, in the last year or so, you've been engaging with a lot of activist groups along kind of quite a range of different subjects and movements in the US.
Right.
Who've you encountered? Who you've been talking to? Which to you have felt like the kind of most interesting and also the most effective kind of movements at the moment?
I've been all over the country in the US. I've been to Berkeley, I've been to Oakland, I've been to Brooklyn, I've been to Durham, North Carolina, I've been to Baltimore, which I ran for Senate in Baltimore, or in the state of Maryland, Brooklyn. Like I keep encountering small communities in a lot of I visit a lot of universities as well, and so it's sort of like student activists, small communities that have more organic organizing, grassroots organizing. That seems to be what I've been, like the folks that I've been working with the most. And it's also like, I think the most promising, because it's funny, because most small community organizing groups they already know what the problem is. They've already identified it. They also know what they think the solution is and how to come about that solution. So it's not a understanding problem. It's really really astounding just how much like grassroots organizers are ignored by the general sense that oh well, the bigger government, like the state government, will be able to understand this. The federal government will be able to come up with solutions. But really, the communities really know what the issues are in from a local perspective. And I think it's interesting to see how most communities, especially in the U.S., whenever they're organizing, how distant they are from the sort of the broader political conversation that might be going on television or on social media.
Well, do you think there's kind of particular approaches or tactics that these movements are developing or starting to understand? Because sometimes it can feel a lot like we're stuck in, despite the very contemporary nature of the threats, the raid against these kind of movements, whether those are technological, whether those are forms of kind of large-scale systemic oppression that we're only really beginning to kind of get our heads around.
Right.
We still seem to resort quite often to the kind of very familiar protest tactics or kind of opposition tactics.
Right. So, a significant part of that is, the more traditional, like showing up to a protest or campaigning in a local election, or especially because in local elections in the U.S., there's a lot of smaller referenda or propositions depending on where you are, ballot initiatives, and so a lot of these policies can be, there's more traditional means in which these things get discussed and brought up, but increasingly there's a need that I feel for community organizers, and sometimes in coalition with other organizers, to really explore more options, and because you're not just limited to voting or to signing a petition or to doing doing a protest with chants and signs and having a permit. We're seeing a lot more of these more risky and aggressive and like confrontational approaches to activism that I think in this time are quite valid and necessary, but it's also creating because it shifts the debate. It moves the needle. Whereas I think that whenever you're trying to work inside of an existing system, the needle doesn't move very much because the structure, kind of keeps you from doing that. So I think that, I mean, just a few months, it's been a month and a half since I was in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and I watched these students and like local organizers in the Chapel Hill area pulled down a Confederate statue after 50 years of trying to get this thing down through numerous processes and numerous movements since 1968. They just failed to do it. And after frustration and the symbolism of everything that's going on in America with race and police violence and the protection of really extreme right-wing views in America, it came to a head, and they finally just pulled it down. And it was one of the most inspiring things I've ever seen in my life. And and I'm still coming off of the heels of witnessing that. Even though it was just a very small local moment. I mean, it did get national attention, and I'm sure it got some international attention. But for me, it was just the intensity and the way in which that sort of organically happened. Nobody told them to do that. They just did. They just finally did a thing that changed the conversation. So it moved the needle of the conversation very far along. And so there's numerous examples of this. It's probably a more extreme example, to say the least.
And what do you feel is your role in participating in that? Or do you see them as mirroring some of your own experience of having taken that step of action?
I always stand in solidarity with these folks. I do feel a strong affinity. I feel what I've done in my life is very similar. I mean, I saw something that I felt needed to happen based upon the values that I had and the information that I had in a particular moment in my life. And I did something about it, but the existing system wouldn't allow for change in that way. So I think that I see a lot of correlation. I mean, certainly the scale of this is very different, but for me, it means a lot to me to see folks doing this stuff. And it's honestly, it's kind of validating for me to just be with these people and to be there to when they if they get arrested, to be there outside the jail and to put some money down for bail, or to say a nice thing on Twitter, to say a good thing or raise awareness about it on Twitter, or it's where my passion is, and I feel like their passion and my passion line up perfectly.
You never expected, certainly not going into the military, that you would be in a position to be able to take the kind of action that you did.
Right. I was just doing statistics. That's the way I saw it. So it was so in Iraq and Afghanistan, the systems that we were using needed. When you're an analyst, it's a very abstract job. At least the one that I had was when I was doing it stateside, because I did this job for a year before I deployed to Iraq. It's a very abstract job, and in that job, it's very math-based. It's very much about tweaking data set, a very complex, very rich, different types of data sets, getting them to work together with each other and make predictions and create a predictive model. And that's very separated. You understand that you have to understand the data, and the volume of data is just tremendous. At least even at the time, it's nothing compared to what it is today. But it's it's very separated from reality. It was once I understood from being in this environment and realizing that what I'm working with aren't just database records. They're not just, they're not just reports. They're human beings attached to this, and there's like people living lives, and the worst, the very like worst parts of people, the flaws and the vulnerabilities, and the best parts of people, the hopes and dreams and desires and human connections that we have, like, are all tied up in this. And that's, when you tie it all together like that, you can't do that anymore. And I think, that once that happened, and it doesn't just happen overnight, I think that was a primary motivator. But, I didn't, so obviously I reached out and I tried to do something about it. So I went to the Washington Post and the New York Times, and eventually I went to, I went and I uploaded it to WikiLeaks, and like it became a thing. But at the same time, it's really hard for me because I did this, and then I ended up going to prison immediately and not really having the time to process it all. So it was just like, then it was just survival. So solitary confinement, survival, and
so for me, there's a huge correlation really between the way in which we fail to see a lot of the kind of societal structures around us, whether those are kind of structures of surveillance, whether there's these kind of data-driven structures that seem so kind of abstract, and the kind of systems within society itself, political systems, systems of oppression, systems of power, that are hard for most people to read.
Well, they're supposed to be.
Absolutely, right? So what's the moment when they become less abstract? Or how do you...
Well, when it happens to you, or when you see it happen, when you see the effects of it happen in front of you, I think that's... I mean, it's very easy, and I lived... Before I was homeless, I didn't really understand the issues of homelessness. Before I went into the military, I didn't really understand the problems of the military-industrial complex and foreign, like how foreign affairs works and how the defense industry works. And it wasn't until I went to prison that I understood just how the criminal justice system works, how prisons work, how the education system and the American education system correlates to the prison system, and how the prison system connects to the military, like in the military-industrial complex in this really like complex way, post 9/11, and you don't really, they're abstractions and are distant because they're not in your life. And so it's very hard to see the bigger picture because you're not supposed to see the bigger picture. It's supposed to be large, it's supposed to be vast, it's supposed to be complicated, and you just want to like live in your small bubble, but once something is penetrated into and popped that bubble, you can't return.
Do you think that there's is it possible for people who don't have that direct experience of it happening to them, like what's the role for kind of supporting either people in particular positions within the military who may have something to say, or people in wider society who are oppressed? What's the role for those of us who are not in the position to blow a whistle or to kind of act directly in that way? I guess...
listen. Like whenever somebody tells you that they have an experience, a deep personal experience that only they have, listen to them, because you just don't know. I don't know what a person of color in America goes through, so I listen to what they have to say. I don't know what an immigrant in today's society has to go through, so I listen to them. I'm taking them at their word because they have an experience that I don't have. I didn't really understand this until coming out and being trans. Like I understand now that I have experiences that a lot of people don't have, and all I expect and all I hope for is for folks to listen to what I have to say about that. And that's where the understanding was going to begin, is to just start and not be like, well, I think so-and-so should be doing this, because you don't know what their experience is. You don't know what their life is like. You don't know what they have to deal with. It's very, you just have to listen and trust, folks.
And you've spoken a lot about the necessity of making some of this stuff more visible and accessible to people so that they can understand. You said
well, it is accessible. It's all around us. It is visible. I don't think that again, it's not that we don't see it and we don't know about it. Now, like that might have been an issue before, but now it's not. I think that now the issue is what we do about that. Like we know that, we know about, the vast, and very complex problems that come with the military. We know about the vast surveillance programs that we have. We know about, what social media, platforms and advertising companies are doing with their data. We know about, all this like large-scale, vast, very complex and data-driven manipulation, and we know about it. This isn't a knowledge problem; it's an action problem.
So, how do you see the effects of some of the kind of these other releases? So, like, if the answer is not simply to kind of release and make accessible more information,
it's a part of it, but it's not. That's not it. And you have to, like everyone else, has a responsibility and a role in this too. And because we all have political agency, we all have the ability to do something. And it's not until we recognize that and really start to assert our political agency in these things, as individuals often, that anything will really be done about it. I think there's an expectation by a lot of folks that somebody's going to come and fix it when nobody's going to fix this stuff. It's not going to happen on its own. You just, in the U.S., Congress isn't going to fix the problems with social media and social networks. None of these things are going to be addressed in the way that I think people expect or are. I think it's somebody else's problem. It's a very big, it's sort of the mentality, the mind, the thought that's going in a lot of folks' head, and it's just that's not how the world works. We have to solve it, and it's not gonna it's not gonna we can't expect a broken system to fix itself. You have to provoke it to change. You have to make it happen.
And other structural ways we can engage with that as well. So particularly speaking as a technologist, someone who's involved in technology, what is the role of actually creating new structures or infrastructures around this stuff to either facilitate different kinds of protests, as I said, to not simply repeat the kind of old protest tactics of the past, or to permit new kind of dialogues to happen? What I'm thinking of are the fact that we often feel like a lot of the tools that are in use are purely in the hands of the people who work in advertising or the people who work in the military. Is there a role for those technologies for all of us to kind of use and engage with as well?
Yeah, I think the problem is it's a centralization problem where a lot of these tools are very centralized. There are household names all over the world now: Facebook, Google, Twitter. I think that's a core part of the problem. We need to decentralize that and make it a lot more level of a playing field for folks. Because internet service providers and data, data content generators, like news outlets and things, they have a disproportionate amount of say and influence on these systems. And so it's about decentralizing that, reducing the role that they play and increasing the role that we play. So I think that there isn't a one-size-fits-all answer for that. And I think that, again, it comes back to why I keep going to local communities, because time and time again, I keep seeing that we can start doing this, but it's going to happen locally. It's not going to happen on, it's not going to happen on a big scale until it starts to happen on a small scale.
Do you see a relationship? One of the things that I think about with regards to technology and this kind of coming to understand the world all the time is the way it performs this incredible dual role. In the one way, technology allows for this kind of quite intense surveillance and kind of control culture to emerge. On the other hand, it allows for this kind of incredible range of representations to emerge. I don't think we would have the feminist cultures and the trans cultures that we have in the present moment, kind of without the growth of these technologies as well. Has that been a part of how you've come to your own kind of forms of representation and being able to speak through these networks?
On that, I just want to say, I think that there's a misunderstanding that's happening here. You know, there's, especially when it comes to, in regards to like some folks' identity, like me as a trans person, as a trans woman, sure, we're a lot more visible, we're a lot more out there. That's not the, visibility is not the same thing as equality. Just because you now are being seen doesn't mean that you're not, in a state in which you're not having to deal with problems disproportionately in comparison to other folks who have different privileges in society. And so, that's a systemic thing. That's not going to be solved by an AI system. That's not going to be solved by a tool that comes out. That is a systemic problem that can only be addressed when we challenge the assumptions, the core assumptions about the way we structure our entire society. Because it's not about tweaking a little bit here or there. It's about really questioning the fundamental assumptions that we make about how we run our society. I'm in the context of the United States. I think there's an assumption that there needs to be a president. At one time there wasn't, and so now there is, and it's been assumed that you need to have a single office that has a huge amount of power. But, is that really true? And the answer is, if you really start to ask questions about the fundamental systems that we have, do we need a prison system? Like, these sort of fundamental, deeper questions, I think, are where we're gonna see, real change maybe being possible. But I think that expecting a system, like a computer system or a new tool that comes out to solve that is, I think, going to be disappointing.
I'm not asking necessarily if there's like a magic tool that's going to kind of solve this. It just feels like we give up a huge amount of agency to these systems that we don't really think too much about, whether they're kind of opaque political systems or whether they're these kind of vast technological systems. At the same time, society itself is becoming more kind of obviously diverse, visibly, perhaps not actually politically and equally in all these kind of ways.
Right.
But there's a definite increase in that visibility. And I guess I'm just trying to understand to what extent the way in which, by looking at a kind of complex technological system, one can develop this kind of complex understanding of complex systems, whether the diversity of society kind of performs that role as well. So what essentially I'm talking, I guess, is the value of intersectionality when you're talking about the LGBTQ plus politics in the US, aligning with racial justice movements, aligning with feminist issues, like what it means to be able to go from one protest to another in the US and see those things intersecting and how they connect.
Yeah, well, they are absolutely connected, because as you see, a lot of different groups are impacted by problems that are created by the same people, just in different ways.
Could you perhaps speak to one of those kind of examples?
If folks who are dealing with immigration in the U.S. have a documentation problem. Trans people also have a documentation problem in a slightly different way, because sometimes our gender markers are policed on us, and it's sort of the same way. It's this diaspora of different people who are affected in different ways by the same system. So we can engage with each other and have solidarity with each other, even though we're not affected in the same way. We can understand that, we can work together because we can see that and feel that and recognize that. So, going to the intersectionality aspect, I think that that goes towards what you're trying to say.
Yeah. So, the other form of direct action which you've alluded to, which you took earlier this year, was to run for the Senate, which was kind of a larger...
It's a little more traditional of a...
Yeah, absolutely. So why that Why that?
Well, I think that there's a utility. I mean, the American political system is not just about running for political office. There's also the media aspect. And the simple fact of the matter is that if you run for political office in America, you're given a platform. People want to interview you. You're also given an argument. You're given a space to make a debate. And a lot of the ideas that I was talking about in my Senate campaign were ideas that I just never saw anywhere else. I was talking about abolishing ICE. I was talking about defunding police departments. I was talking about universal basic income. Like a lot of these more out of the mainstream ideas, because they're out of the mainstream because they've never been brought to the table before. So I wanted to bring some of those to the table and increase the amount of options in the debate. And I thought, there was some utility in that, to say the least. So I was really using a traditional method to do something not traditional.
And in that process, did you meet a lot of other people who seemed to have this kind of agency that we're all trying to kind of work towards? Whether they were actually people who were kind of like well-known in this, or whether they were kind of politically operative? What was their view of how they were shifting these issues or bringing these issues to the
who
table?
Exactly?
Whether other politicians, other
Oh,
politicians.
okay.
So what I'm interested in is these different roles within.
That came later. Interestingly enough, there is an increase in more diverse ideas in the political mainstream in America right now. But that wasn't, whenever I was going through it earlier this year, this wasn't the case. This is starting to change, but it's also not a drastic change. Like I was saying some really drastically different things than folks were saying, but I definitely didn't encounter anyone who would talk to me in that way for a while.
Sure. My question was always, because I keep coming back to this thing of saying, who has agency? Who has the power to act?
We do.
Yes. But people understand.
That's not an abstraction. That's a reality.
It's not abstraction. But why do you think most people don't feel that they do? Because actually, this is the thing that comes up
we've
against
been spoon-fed this narrative our whole lives. I mean, I certainly have. I mean, I'm not saying everybody's gone through this, but it feels like the government is this thing that happens on TV. That all these debates are something that happens far, far away. That wars happen way over there. It's this feeling, this sense of this is all outside. Obviously, that's changed in a lot of ways more recently, because now I feel like everything in the world is impacting me every day, especially if I'm on my phone too long. But
what do you think? What do you think that kind of vastness of social media, that constant accessibility of this information, is doing to people? Because to me, it's very connected to what you say is this visibility of everything, right? This belief that visibility will sort of magically improve stuff, and yet we're all constantly looking at all the visibility of everything, and yet
Right.
It doesn't actually be shifting us in a particularly useful direction.
Well, again, it's who's behind the tools. It's there is still somebody behind the curtain of the Wizard of Oz of the social media tools, and that is that is the algorithms that are showing you the things that you're seeing. Because it's not like you get to select a list. You kind of get this timeline, and you get this feed, and that's weighted based upon a lot of different factors. And it's interesting that there's actually feedback loops that happen, especially with social media. It's very similar to the feedback loops that you see in policing or in combat operations, where you have a significant amount. You've spent a lot of resources, say policing or putting troops into a particular neighborhood, so you get more reporting. There's more activities happening there because you're getting more reporting. Well, the machine learning algorithms will learn that, and they'll take that and they'll be like, okay, in the future there's probably going to be more, and so it predicts that. So you end up with this hotspot where you end up with a hotspot that just ends up getting hotter and hotter and hotter because you're not collecting the data as evenly. This happens on social media as well, where somebody will tweet something and it makes some people upset that this happened. So it generates a lot of content, because a lot of people are mad about this. But the algorithm picks up on that. And so it encourages people to become more upset and more angry about it, which makes it a debate, which creates a huge amount of content. And as you develop more content in this particular area, the algorithm picks up on that and it shows you more of it. So it becomes this feedback loop. So it's the same hot-spotting effect that's happening in predictive policing and in military operations. It's happening on Twitter and on Facebook.
And the connection there is as well to the things we talked about before, this return of kind of military technologies, not just to policing, but to everyday life.
Right.
Something like Cambridge Analytica, which was essentially a lot of former military psychological operations people coming back and working on
it's a very
election
incestuous
technologies.
Industry. It's a very incestuous industry.
Yeah, there's connections between those. But the industry college is interesting because you describe these as being like the algorithms behind these things.
Well, I mean, there are people developing it, but obviously oftentimes the decision makers or the policy makers don't get it. They don't understand it at all. They just want the results. And so I think that there's definitely a differentiation between the people who develop the algorithms, the people who interpret the results of the algorithms, and the algorithms themselves. Because I think of algorithms as almost being a sort of primitive living entity at this point. It definitely feels that way. Every time I work with a machine learning algorithm, I get this chilly feeling sometimes with the outputs, to say the least.
Yeah, we seem to have trouble kind of really describing them in terms that we can...
It's an inorganic life form, is how I like to describe it.
Yeah, we're heading that way. But I mean, just before, I'd love to talk some more about that, but just for that, just for this question of who's behind the algorithms, and we have seen the hints of a kind of change in that. We saw the people who work at Google, for example, refuse to work on kind of military technologies for Google itself.
Microsoft had a very similar thing happen with immigration, with the ICE, with connections to ICE and contracts with the Immigration and Customs Enforcement in the U.S. And so
have you spoken to people who kind of work within those organizations?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, many of them are my friends, so it's... I know that Cade Crawford does a lot of good work.
The AI Now Foundation.
Yes, the AI Now Foundation is I think a very good place to look at as sort of a model for where we can start to focus our understanding and research and development and understanding what the ethical consequences of these systems are. But it's not the end-all be-all. In fact, I think that there's not going to be a significant amount of change in the way that machine learning works until algorithm developers start to say enough is enough. And it's starting to happen, but it's sort of uneven and it's a bit of a patchwork quilt. I think that the community, dare I say, we borrow a lot of techniques and tactics from the labor movements of the 19th and 20th century. Your strikes and your walkouts and your go slows. We can adopt these tactics as developers in order to really force the institutions to change or to not implement, or maybe we shouldn't implement some of these tools in the first place. A bit like how many of the scientists who were involved in the Manhattan Project felt that they shouldn't have done that. They felt afterwards that they had more of a responsibility not to even develop that in the end in the first place. And I think we should start asking the same questions, because so many of these tools, in the same way that a doctor has an ethical responsibility, because at any moment that doctor has like a responsibility to a patient, machine learning algorithm developers have responsibility to millions of people because they're affecting millions of people, often for life and death, consequences and decisions. And it could be something, like somebody getting credit denied, but a million times over. Somebody who gets arrested more often, a million times over. So like these responsibilities are even higher than doctors in some sense. So I think that the ethical constraints should be at least the equivalent of, if not better.
Yeah, this is where we get into this trouble question, though, when we say that all of us can act. A lot of people feel that technology itself is not something that they have this kind of understanding of or ability to act towards, right? Because it's part of the system that they even though they know it kind of surrounds them, it's not something that they fully understand. So where should
we don't
people
have
go
to understand it?
Okay.
I mean, you don't need to have a full understanding to know that this system is having this consequence. You can see that. That's not a difficult thing. And again, it goes back to the communities that I keep seeing where they're affected by some policy that is 50% of the time impacted in some way to the machine learning, the adoption by the government or by corporations of machine learning algorithms. It's fascinating to see this on the micro as well as the macro.
Absolutely. Do you think that these technologies can be deployed, I mean, for good? I come back to this question of the way in which so many contemporary identities and kind of voices against are still being kind of amplified through these technologies in different ways. Is machine learning something, or any of these advanced technologies, ones that can be deployed in more equitable ways for more kind of emancipatory purposes? Is it a matter of who's deploying them?
Yes. It's a matter of who's deploying them. It's a matter of who has possession of the system, who is developing it, and in many cases, machine learning algorithm development and the research and development cycle is opaque to the outside world. So there's no peer review. There's it's a black box, if you will. Like it's a computer says yes kind of thing, and that I think that these are the kinds of things that are in the way of making it a much more, liberatory tool or technology. But again, I want to be very clear that technology, and especially like machine learning, it doesn't have there's no inherent value in it, like from a moral perspective. They don't have moral values. So technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. It's whatever values we put into it makes it that. So I think that we really need to have a more democratized control, not just influence, but control over these systems. That's why I do think that decentralization, as well as being more transparent, is a more long-term equitable result.
I think there's such this incredibly powerful parallel between what you're saying about the biases that are inherent in these technologies, but also the fact that these biases weren't really visible to us before, right? We knew they were occurring.
This goes back to the ethics part.
Yeah.
It's not that developers were not aware of the bias in these systems. It's the fact that it was in the interest of the institutions or the decision makers or the policy makers for those outputs to be the case. So they were looking for, oftentimes the most dangerous thing about these tools and how they get used today is that oftentimes they're designed to just rubber stamp a policy that that decision makers who aren't technologists often want. So it's not that these are bugs, it's their features from the perspective of them, not for us, but for them often, it entrenches incumbency, it entrenches the incumbent systems and controls. This definitely wasn't an awareness thing. I certainly knew about the biases in the systems that I was working with. This was 8 years ago. There was an awareness of it. It's just that nobody was doing anything about it because, despite an awareness of it, the demands were still being placed on technology developers at that stage. And to keep your job, you really had to meet that. Which is one of the reasons why I think we need to put the responsibility on us rather than on the employers.
So what would this more diversified technology system look like? Would it be the people who are working on it? Would it be the tools that are being used? Or would it be the kind of range of issues that are being brought to bear?
I don't know, but I think everybody should be talking about this, because I don't think that I don't think it's a one size fits all. Like, there's a solution for everything, and I'm not the person to just say that here's the prescription, here's the solution. What we need to have these discussions in the first place, and that's not happening.
Thank you all very much, and to ask you all with me to thank Chelsea very much indeed for being here and speaking.